Welcome to a Quick Intelligence business briefing. With me I've got Dave Millier, who is a renowned security expert and literally wrote the book on security breached, and it's a bestseller on Amazon. And David, do you want to tell everybody a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I'm Dave Millier. I've been doing cybersecurity for almost 25 years, and with a particular focus on helping companies prepare for and prevent security breaches from happening. So I wrote the book Breached to educate businesses and help them to be better prepared in the unlikely event of a breach or in the unfortunate event of a breach, so that they can ideally prepare and prevent. And even if the breach occurs, it doesn't necessarily mean that it needs to be a catastrophic event, as long as they prepare properly for it.
So why is breach readiness such a hot topic right now?
Well, I think there's a couple of reasons. One, of course, we're reading more and more in the news about breaches almost every day. We're hearing about companies that are being attacked and having significant damages. And one of the other reasons here in Canada is recently the government put in legislation which actually requires companies to be prepared to notify their customers, their employees, etc., in the event that a breach occurs, and there are significant penalties if they aren't prepared for it. So I think those two factors are really forcing companies to finally start to look at things, and instead of waiting for it to happen and then responding to it, they're starting to realize that if they can be preventative and prepare for it, then there's the much better opportunity to respond.
But shouldn't I really focus on breach prevention? I mean, once the cat's out of the bag, isn't it too late?
Well, yes and no. There's certainly things that you need to be doing as an organization to prepare yourself. So it's not just a matter, as I say, of waiting for the breach to occur and then sort of responding to it. There are certainly things that you can do to prevent, but the reality is that there are a lot of what they call zero-day attacks, so things that you simply can't prepare for. And even, as I mentioned before, even if you do have a breach, if you've prepared properly for it, you can't prepare for everything, obviously, but if you have your ducks in a row, if you've got your basic documentation in place, you've got your strategy on how you'll respond to in place, then that prevention combined with being ready to respond can make all the difference. We talk about breaches literally being the difference between seconds or minutes and hours, or unfortunately for a lot of companies it's the difference between hours and days, depending on how prepared they actually are.
So how do I detect a breach in the first place?
Well, there's a few different ways, and then again we have the traditional unfortunately, the news, picking up the phone and calling, which a lot of companies, unfortunately, nowadays, that's the first time that you're even aware they have a breach, and those are the companies that haven't prepared. A lot of companies are relying on what are managed security services providers, so they're relying on a service provider to actually help them by monitoring 24/7, just like a building where you put a monitoring solution in place to let you know if somebody's breaking into your office or into your store. You do the same thing where you have somebody monitoring your network, your systems, looking for unusual activity and letting you know, so that early warning system can make all the difference in the world. Again, more companies are realizing they need to do that. A lot of companies have basic security in place, but they're relying on their own IT group, and so the challenge with that is that those people get sick, those people go on training, those people have other jobs to do beyond just looking at sort of what's happening day to day, and so even though they've moved the bar forward a little bit, they haven't moved it forward enough, because again, those people aren't there 24/7. So certainly having some type of solution in place that can monitor your network, monitor the activity on the systems themselves, makes a huge difference in that early detection.
So my understanding now with the new legislation is that once you've detected a breach, that you have to determine how significant it is, because there are steps you have to take if it's below or above a certain level of significance.
That's right. The first thing you have to determine is whether or not the breach actually resulted in any type of data theft. So the first thing you're looking to do is determine, because as I mentioned before, just because you have a breach doesn't necessarily mean that you've suffered damage as a result of it. Somebody could break in and take nothing. Somebody could break in and you have proper layers of defense in place, if you will, and as a result of that, they don't actually do any damage. And of course, if you've got the monitoring in place, you can do that. But one of the first things you have to do in a breach is try to determine what, if anything, was accessed, what information was accessed, was any information exfiltrated, so did somebody actually take that information outside of the organization? And what you're really looking to do is to determine whether that information would be of value to somebody. Is that information that's your information? Is it somebody's personal information? Is it health-related information? Is it credit card or payment-related information? So any information basically that by its leakage or by its theft could cause damage to an individual or to a business, you have a legal obligation to inform.
Now, of course, that implies that you're logging all this.
That's correct. So again, back to the monitoring that we talked about earlier. If you don't have any logging in place, it's very difficult for you to be able to determine what, if anything, was taken. I've worked on numerous breaches after the fact where we've been brought in to help companies to try to figure out, what damage was done, what information was taken, and they don't have any logging, or they don't have very minimal logging. They're just relying on the default built-in system logging, and in almost all cases, it's not enough. So there's not the ability to detect. Now, some companies will use that to their advantage by being able to say, well, we don't see any evidence that any information was taken, but it's a little bit disingenuous, because the reality is that if there was a breach and somebody has been poking around in the systems, and unfortunately usually it's not a very small breach, usually they're in there for hours or days or weeks, or in some cases we see months and even years where the attackers have actually been in the systems for a significant period of time, and because there's no monitoring in place, there's nothing to detect or notify them that it's happening. And that's where we get that, it's the FBI calling, or it's the credit card companies calling and saying, we're seeing a lot of credit cards being, or stolen credit cards being used, and the one common place that all those cards was used is you. That was the Home Depot breach from a couple of years ago. That was the Target breach. So when we see these very large credit card breaches, that's how they trace them back very quickly. They're looking for that common merchant that would have used, that all of those people would have shopped at.
So then I have to have a system in place for monitoring. I have to have a system for detecting breaches. I have to have log files in place now for to be able to go and see the extent of it. But what about putting a procedure in place to actually handle the breach itself? What do I do to put that process in place?
So we talk about building a breach readiness program, and the idea there is to have a number of what we call playbooks. So depending on the type of breach, if it's a ransomware outbreak, if it's a stolen laptop, if it's an active attack where somebody's actually, you can see that there's evidence that somebody's in the network, each one of those playbooks provides guidance on how you would respond and how you would react to those things. And those are all part of an overarching breach readiness program. We call it a CSIRP, a Cybersecurity Incident Response Program. And the idea is really to be ready to respond to various types of breaches, and you can't identify every one that could happen, and so you need to have a general response plan as part of that as well.
So who's involved in that response plan? Is it all the way up to the executives?
Absolutely. So you've got different, because there's outward facing, if you will, which usually senior management will get involved with, potentially even board of directors, depending on the organization. So there's communication outward, outside of the organization, to let people know what's going on, especially as things become public, which a lot of times with breaches they do. And then there's the people that actually have to work to respond to the breach, to prevent the breach, or to minimize the damage from the breach if it's happening, to shut it down if somebody's actively on the systems themselves, and of course to determine what, if any, damage has taken place, and then ultimately to work towards recovery. So this all follows a life cycle. If you think about it, there's the planning, it's figuring out what do we need to do, or what would we do in the event of a breach. There's implementing those different solutions. You talked about things like logging and monitoring, so it's getting those tools in place. It's making sure that people are trained, they know how to do things properly. And then it's that managing on an ongoing basis. It's making sure that things are actually working as we expect them, the logging's working, the monitoring's working. And the last piece, which is one of the most crucial pieces that most companies overlook, is testing it. And so you need to not just wait for the breach to happen, but you need to do breach readiness testing. And so we talk about tabletop exercises, and the idea is to actually simulate a breach with a group of people, the executives ideally, as well as the people that would respond, get everybody in a room, and typically it's a 2 to 4 hour exercise, and the idea is that we build a scenario, a realistic scenario that may actually happen, and then we work through that scenario. Really, you work through the scenario, the company works through the scenario with our guidance and assistance, and the goal is to see how effective the incident response program that they've built actually is. So does the playbook actually work? Does the process that they've designed actually work? And of course, the goal is twofold. Number one, it's to ensure that they have the processes in place, and number two, it's to constantly be learning and constantly be tuning, so you make sure that that process is a little bit better.
So this doesn't sound like something that organizations can really do themselves without some outside help.
Well, they can if they have the right resources, but the reality is most organizations don't have the right resources, right? So the people that they have are usually pretty good operational people. They may have what's called a CISO, a Chief Information Security Officer, so somebody who has hopefully a good depth of background on the security side. But engaging an outside organization like Quick Intelligence to help them makes a big difference, because you're relying on somebody who's got years and years of expertise in that area, years of expertise in building security programs and building out the playbooks themselves, and then of course in training and educating the companies in how to actually respond.
Great. Well, I think that's a wrap. Thank you very much, David. That was a great explanation. And if you have any questions, please get in contact with us at quickintel.com. Thank you.
Thanks.